Today we're going to consider how a set of other different psychological aspects like personality, lifestyle, and values impact the consumer decision-making process. So first, let's start discussing personality. And what we're going to essentially talk about is how personality essentially determines how consumers act. So what kind of behaviors should we expect from consumers? Also how they respond to marketing stimuli in general in the marketplace. And because of that, we're going to pay special attention to A, what personality is, B, how can we actually measure personality. There are different inventories or measurement sets that have been developed over time. We're going to discuss at least two of them in this presentation. And then once that we understand what personality is and how to measure it, what implications this has actually from marketing and consumer behavior in general. Okay, so to discover or to discuss personality, what we're going to do is we're going to start with probably the grandfather, if you have to call it something, or the father of a lot of the modern psychology work, which is Freud. And the first thing that we're going to try to do to understand how Freud looked at personality is what are the different elements that Freud discussed. The first one is the id. And according to Freud, every human being has this innate force in them that pushes them to seek pleasure and immediate gratification, and he called it the id, right? So this is kind of like a wild animal instinct that it's built in humans, and because we're animals after all, right? At least to some degree. And because of that, we always have this drive to get short-term pleasure out of things, food, sex, anything really. Then kind of like the counterpart to the id is what Freud calls the superego, right? Which is kind of just the opposite. It's a little bit like the conscience of people. Here you have Jiminy Crickets from the movie Pinocchio, and he plays the role of the conscience, right? Trying to help Pinocchio make the right decisions, right? So the superego is essentially like your conscience that reminds you that maybe instant gratification is not the right thing to do. So this is kind of the counterbalance to that wild force that is pushing us to look for immediate pleasure, not pressure. And then also Freud discusses kind of like a mediator between these two polar opposite forces, the id and the superego, and that mediator is the ego, right? And the ego is essentially trying to find or strike a bargain between the id and the superego, right? So trying to find pleasures that are acceptable socially, right? So instead of maybe eating 7 pizzas, you only eat 2 pieces of pizza, right? So trying to find a balance between what it is that you want because you're looking for that immediate pleasure and what it is that is acceptable or maybe even right, the right thing to do. So kind of like a mediator in between the two forces. And the way that bargain is stricken, according to Freud, is following this reality principle, right? Which is kind of like, the idea that you can have everything that you want, right? So long as it's acceptable socially, the rest of the group or society at large, then you can maybe get some of that gratification or pleasure, but it needs to be with that caveat, right? It needs to be something that it's acceptable in the current moment, given the current social structure and what's reasonable. Okay. So this is a little bit the 3 main forces that Freud discusses when discussing the personality and behavior that he was observing in his patients, right? And now what we're going to do is we're going to discuss some of the followers of Freud, some of their students that basically marked to a great degree what psychology it is in the modern era. So the first of Freud's students that we are going to discuss, or disciples, I don't know, disciples is the right word, is Dichter, and he studied with Freud in Vienna. And what he did is he applied a lot of the Freudian thinking when it comes down to personality, those forces that we were talking about, and try to see whether those apply to different product categories and the motives that people actually had for buying the products that they actually bought. And he conducted a series of in-depth interviews about over 200 product categories. So this was quite an extensive empirical study where he will carefully interview consumers about, their product purchasing and using behaviors. And he identified what we call now motivational research, right? Which we've already talked a little bit about motivation in the past, right? So Dichter is one of the scholars that started the trend of looking at motives as an important force when it comes down to consumption and product use, right? So he identified a series of motives that were behind the behavior that he will observe, right? So some of these may be unconscious, something that maybe you don't realize. So getting to then require in-depth interviews and kind of like trying to dig deep into the motives. And you can see some of them right here, right? From masculinity, virility, the opposite to that, or I don't know if the opposite, the contrary to that will be femininity, but many of the others that I guess will not be surprising to you, like social acceptance, right? People want to be part of a group, right? We've talked about some of them. Eroticism, right? Sex appeal is something that it's used in many product categories. Like many times you will see an ad for a car, and for whatever reason there is a very beautiful lady sitting on the car, right? Why? Right? Because if you have this car, maybe you can get that one, right? So anyway, so you can see here a few of the different motives that underline a lot of the consumption patterns that you actually see according to Dichter's work, which is based on Freud's again. Who else I want to touch upon? You can see that there are others, some of them really big in the psychology literature, like Alfred Adler, for example, who had a very sad and, I don't know, negative view of the world, and basically identified the main motivation as basically trying to overcome the inferiority that we all feel, right? We feel less than others. And, what we end up doing is we're trying to, mitigate that by maybe buying things or engaging in other behaviors that will enable us to overcome that sense of inferiority. And then the other student from Freud's perspective, or that I want to really emphasize, is Carl Jung. Carl Jung, along with Freud, is one of the, if you have to mention 3 or 4 psychologists, definitely Freud and Jung should be 2 of those 3 or 4. Some of the most influential thinkers, at least from a psychology perspective, of the history of psychology period. I was going to say of the 20th century, but that would be an underestimation. So let's talk a little bit in detail, although, limited detail, some of Carl Jung's work. By the way, Carl Jung was Freud's student also, but let's just say that towards the later stages of his career, he had strong arguments with Freud, and they didn't see things eye to eye. According to Jung, Freud was too obsessed with sexuality, and Jung didn't think that that was the main force driving a lot of the behaviors that he would observe in his practice. So he developed his own view of both personality and the world. So let's talk a little bit about that. So, like I said before, Carl Jung was Freud's student, but he had a different view of the world. Instead of talking so much about the internal and individual part of the personality and this internal drive to basically seek pleasure, he talks about this idea of the collective unconscious, which is very different from the thoughts that Freud was discussing. So the collective unconscious is basically all the know-how and stories that are transmitted to the individual from their forefathers, right? From your parents, from your grandparents, and from everybody else that has lived in the past before you, right? I mean, if you think about society, it's almost a miracle, right? That society is the way it is, given that human beings tend to be quite destructive and we are always fighting and arguing, as you can probably see nowadays if you're reading the news, and there are wars in all sorts of countries. So it's almost a miracle that we have actually succeeded, in the sense that we have not, destroyed everything. We might get there one day, who knows. But this idea of collective unconscious is how knowledge basically gets transmitted from generations to generations. So the collective unconscious is this process, this entity that enables you to learn without having to make the same mistakes, hopefully, that your forefathers actually did or committed, right? And to build on that collective unconscious and to kind of give it more relatable, I think, and that's my reading at least, although reading Jung is complicated. Let's put it like that. He tried to make this concept of collective unconscious more relatable, and he talks about archetypes. Now, what is an archetype? An archetype, it's a character that seems to repeat in history over and over and over again, and is capturing a way that humans are, or they can be, that repeats over time, that it goes beyond the idiosyncrasies of the individual. Typical archetype that he will talk about will be the old wise man, right? Somebody who, because of experience, knows a lot about how things function. Maybe he's not educated in a academic sense, but just because they've gone through a lot of experiences, they know a lot, and because of that, they can give you counsel and advice, right? And I'm going to talk more about archetypes in a minute, right? This idea of archetypes is very powerful. Actually, you can see it in movies all the time. If you've paid attention, you will see how a lot of these archetypes repeat in movies, right? So you have, for example, I don't know, pick a movie that I like, The Lord of the Rings, right? Who is the old wise man in The Lord of the Rings, right? It's Gandalf, right? Is the one that can see beyond what's happening at the moment and can actually guide the heroes in the story, right? Actively or semi-actively, right? And this role repeats in many movies, right? Then you have the hero, right? The hero who, it's brave and confronts evil, whatever shape evil takes. The Lord of the Rings, it's Saruman and Sauron, right? But if you don't know what the Lord of the Rings is, or you haven't seen the movies or read the books, it doesn't matter. You can see evil in any action movie, right? It takes different shapes and forms, and the hero confronts those bravely. Sometimes, maybe losing an arm or a leg or something valuable to them, but it still fights with evil and comes hopefully triumphant from it, right? This archetype of the hero, it's a very old story, right? It's something that probably predates a lot of the writings that we have, a lot of the stories that have passed from generations to generations, just when we didn't know how to write, right? Anyway, so these archetypes can actually be used for a marketing purpose. In fact, there is a company called Young and Rubicon, who is an advertising company for the most part, although they do have other consulting services, like, brand consulting. And they actually use this idea of the archetype when they are looking at brand personality. So let's talk a little bit more about this. Okay, so here you have quite extensive set of archetypes that are to some degree based on a lot of the work that Jung actually started, right? And you can see how each of the archetypes has their own personalities, right? Their own values that are associated with that archetype. So you have the magician, right? Somebody who is logical, analytical, and rather insightful, right? So when you think about this, I hope you think about companies or brands like IBM, right? If you know anything about IBM, IBM used to make computers, right? They became famous for that. A lot of the first computers in the planet were actually built by IBM. A lot of the first supercomputers were put together by IBM, like for example Deep Blue, right? I don't know if you guys remember the story. Deep Blue was the first computer that technically beat Grandmaster. I think it was Kasparov in the beginning of the 21st century, right? I don't remember the year. Maybe it was like 2003 or something like that. I could be off by a few years in the year. I'm just going by memory. My memory is bad, right? So it starts with computers and supercomputers. But if you look at IBM right now, IBM is mostly a consulting firm, right? And what they do is they apply science and technology to solve problems. So this idea of logical and analytical and insightful, actually, and I think it makes a lot of sense, right? And then you have others here. You have the patriarch, right? You have the angel. You have an enchantress, I cannot pronounce that very well, right? Who's mysterious and sensual and tempting. And I have here Apple for that, right? If you look at Apple's products, above and beyond working, which is, basic need, right? When it comes to technology, they are oftentimes phenomenally designed from an industrial design perspective. The products are attractive to the touch and to the eyesight, right? So there is kind of like a sensual attraction when it comes down to that, right? They play a lot with design. They try to make it really appealing, sometimes minimalist. They're always ahead when it comes down to these trends. And there's also more to it, maybe tempting, like the Apple, right? I don't know. Good. What else? You have others here. The actress, a troubadour, another word that maybe I cannot pronounce very well, joyous, free-spirited, agile. What kind of firms or brands are associated with that? If I have to pick one, what about Lego? Like Lego is a fascinating company, right? Very successful. Toys that are somewhat thoughtful, right? But, it's a company that, I don't know, to some degree, they don't take themselves really seriously. If you watch the Lego movies, you know what I'm talking about. They make fun of themselves a lot, in a good way, in a good nature fun way, right? So maybe that would be a good archetype, right, to exemplify the values that are associated with that brand. Then I have the jester right here, who is witty and resilient, right, and I have here Old Spice, right? If you watch some of the commercials, I hope you will agree with me that, they poke fun at things in a very straightforward but witty manner too, right? So it's an interesting company. Old Spice is owned by Procter & Gamble, by the way. I'm assuming you know this, but maybe you don't, right? Procter & Gamble is one of the largest consumer packaged goods companies in the world, right? One of the top 4. Good. So Old Spice. Then you have the warrior, right? And anyway, you can see the rest, right? I have some examples here, but there are, if you know about brand personalities and what brands stand for, you can probably place different ones in here, right? Who is a good example of the warrior? I would say Nike. Nike has placed themselves as, a company that is basically powerful, heroic, right? Just do it, get it done, become the best athlete that you can be, right? That sort of idea. Anyway, you can go through the rest. So notice these ideas of the archetypes, they have kind of their own personality. And what's interesting about archetypes is that they transcend the story in the sense that these things, if you read 100 stories, you will see how in many of these stories you can pick some of these archetypes as some of the personalities that you actually see in the characters of the stories. These are timeless, and it's interesting. These also cut across cultures. So if you read stories from other cultures, you will still see the warrior, you will still see the queen, you will still see Mother Earth, right? You will see all these archetypes. These are fascinating, really. And if you're a marketer, you should be well aware of this, right? Because marketing, it's a lot about brands, and brands, they need to be built around values and characteristics that are really appealing to people. And that's what archetypes do to a large degree. Now, along with these archetypes, there is also the shadow version of each of those archetypes, right? Now, if you read Jung, one of the insights, one of the many insights that he developed was this idea of the shadow. The shadow, to oversimplify things, it's the darker side of the personality. Is what somebody can become if the circumstances are not right, if they don't keep their ego in check, right? So here you have the flip side of, at least try to be, the flip side of some of the archetypes in the other slide. Now, I haven't put any brands here because nobody tries to be the dictator or the addict or the idiot, right? But you can become one. And by you, I mean the brand can become, right? And you can do things that are silly and, that show you to be jealous, that show you to be vain or selfish, or that you are scared of competition. So I want you guys to realize that the actions, the marketing actions that are undertaken by the brand, if they are aligned with some of these negative characteristics, could actually give rise to these negative archetypes. Now, what's interesting, I think, is if you read Jung a little bit more carefully, maybe, you will also realize that his perspective on the shadow is a little bit more complex than, the shadow's bad and the other part of the personality is the good part. Because the way Jung really writes about the shadow, it seems like for somebody to be a complete person, they need to develop their shadow, right? Otherwise, maybe you're a little bit of a pushover. So I'm not sure how to integrate that with the brands, right? Maybe there is more to it than what this company is doing. So if you want to do some work in branding, that I think will be a fascinating thing to look at. But that's just my opinion, of course. And I don't know much about this. Okay. Now, another aspect of personality that, is being studied quite a bit is this idea of trait theory, right? Which essentially says, look, personalities are somewhat stable, right? So personality is a set of characteristics that define an individual, and they just don't vary a lot over time, or they can vary a little bit. Okay, so this idea of trait theory is that, personalities are somewhat stable, and because of that, we can measure them and we can study them, right? Good. So if you look at it from this perspective, many different traits or characteristics of personalities have been studied by many people. Okay, but some of them seem to be more related to the kind of concepts that we're talking about when we're identifying how people go about buying and using products, right? And so here you have a few that are particularly relevant. Innovativeness, right? So this idea that, some people are really excited about buying new products, right? Materialism, people are particularly interested in having things instead of people. Self-consciousness, this idea that, you're focused internally into you and those that surround you, but more about you. Okay. Need for cognition and frugality, right? But like I said, there are many traits that you can study when it comes down to personality. And instead of just talking about some of the ones that are maybe more closely related to the kind of aspects that we're talking about, what I want to do is I want to maybe focus on some of the key personality inventories or personality theories. Okay, So let's start with the big five. If I'll have to pick one personality theory that is the most developed, it will be the big five. Although not that far ahead from everything else. But there are literally thousands of scientific journal articles that use or expand our knowledge about the big five. And the big five, what's fascinating, if you are an empiricist like I am, meaning somebody who likes to collect empirical evidence and then try to understand what that means from a scientific standpoint. The big five is a theory that was, for the most part, constructed atheoretically, meaning that we didn't know that there were going to be five main aspects of personality. We just, and by we I mean a bunch of psychologists, they threw in there all the different traits that they could actually think about when it comes down to personality. And, this is a very long inventory of questions that are trying to deal with all sort of personality aspects. And when we analyze that using some psychometric techniques, in particular factor analysis, if you're interested, let me know. I'll be happy to expand this for you. But what it does is it tries to cluster or clump these questions together into things that are similar or that are related to each other, things that covary. If you're into statistics, it deals with correlations, to keep it simple. And what we find over and over and over again is that there are five aspects that are basically the essential aspects of personality. Okay. The first one is openness, right? This is the degree to which you are willing to try new things, right? And be exposed to new experiences, right? Not everybody is, by the way, and that's okay, right? If you're not, that doesn't mean anything bad for you. This is just one trait that has two polar opposites, people that are open, people that are not open, and that's just the way you are, right? Number two is conscientiousness, which is to what degree you want order and structure in your life, right? Some people have to have everything neatly organized, otherwise they just, they get anxious. Other people can live with all sort of chaos in their life and they're okay with it, right? So conscientiousness, again, it's some sort of continuum, and you can be in different areas of this continuum, right? Different people are different. Then you have extroversion, right? So this is how much you want to go outside and, relate to other people in your community and, in society at large, right? Some people are introverted. They just, they get anxious and tired when they actually are with people that they are not very familiar with. And extroverts are the opposite, right? These are people that thrive whenever there are people that they can discuss with, relate to, and interact with, right? And again, the same thing. It's not bad or good thing. It's just a trait that you can be high or low on, okay? Then you have agreeableness, which is the degree to which you're basically willing to defer to what another person it's asking you to do or telling you to do, right? And this is, again, something that some people are very agreeable, some people are very disagreeable. Okay, by the way, if you look at, people that are in prison, you will see that one of the traits that they have in common, most of them, is disagreeableness, right? Not surprising. I'm not saying it's bad, because you will also see that very successful people tend to be very disagreeable, okay? And if you are very disagreeable, you are more likely, for example, to negotiate a higher pay, right? Or ask for a promotion, right? So it's not always negative, but it can have negative connotations sometimes. They all can, by the way. Okay. And then you have neuroticism, or, emotional instability. And this is the degree to which you can cope with stress and difficult situations. Okay. Not everybody can, right? Good. So if you look at these five aspects of personality, or the way people are, you can create, you can explain most of the different personalities and behaviors that we see in consumers, right? So this is actually a very powerful set of dimensions that kind of explain how people are, and because of the way people are, relates to the kind of products that they're going to buy and use in general, right? So this is why we will be interested in this. What is the other big way of measuring or explaining personality? The Myers-Briggs type indicator, right? Also, this is very popular. There are also hundreds, probably not hundreds, thousands of articles that use the Myers-Briggs. And as you will see, a lot of the dimensions are very similar. And this kind of tells you that there is something going on here, because both of these were basically derived empirically, and there are slight differences between one and the other because the questions that were started from slightly different, but a lot of the overarching dimensions that you find are very similar. The first one is focus of attention, which essentially has at the two extremes either introversion or extroversion, which we already talked about, right? The second one is information processing, and this is whether you are more interested in data or you follow more an intuitive path for your decision making. Okay, so do you just process a lot of information or do you go on a hunch, right? That will be a way of looking at this dimension. And the second one, similar to this, decision making, do you go with a more rational approach to decision making? So do you rationalize things and do you think through things carefully, or do you go more with a hunch, right? Do you go more with your feelings, the way you see something and then if you were following our conversation about affect, it sounds like they are talking more about this, right? With decision making by feeling instead of by thinking. And the other aspect that the Myers-Briggs talks about is how do you deal with the outer world, right? And there are two views on this. You can be more of a judgmental person, or you could be somebody who's a little bit more neutral and more perceiving. So you're just trying to gather information. Another one is like, as the information comes, you provide either a balance that is negative or positive, right? And by using these 4 dimensions instead of 5, so not a big discrepancy, but if you know anything about psychometrics, you know that this is not surprising that one says there are 4 dimensions, the other says there are 5. And then they are slightly different, although there is quite a bit of overlap. And based on these 4 dimensions, what Myers-Briggs does is it categorizes people into 16 different categories. Okay, and you can use those categories, for example, as a segmentation criteria. Okay, from a marketing perspective, that will be maybe an interesting exercise to follow, and you won't be the first one to do it, by the way. Okay, so you can use personality to try to get at what people want, need, and use, right? Which is the ultimate reason why we do segmentation. And instead of using demographics, maybe you can use something that is hopefully more predictive of actual behavior, like their personality. Good. Now, not only people have personalities, but brands do as well. Okay, brands do as well. And what do we mean by personality? Well, it's a set of traits or associations that describe how the brand is, right? So when you think about any brand, especially brands that have been in the marketplace for long enough and you know enough about, you can describe to me what the brand is like if it were a person, okay? And that's what we mean by personalities, right? Good. So here you have a few examples, right? You have like Harley Davidson, for example, as something that it's iconic because, it exemplifies the rebel in you, right? So the typical story that you will hear around Harley Davidson is you have somebody who is an executive that, usually works long hours, usually dressed in a suit formally, maybe in a financial institution, right? Where people still dress quite formally, maybe in a bank, right? And then when the weekend comes, he takes off his jacket, right? He puts on some leather jacket and maybe some leather pants, and instead of a helmet, he just wears, I don't know, like some sort of hair device, I don't know, like a bandana or something like that, right? And some shades because, helmets are for you know who, right? And now you are a true rebel by, getting into your Harley Davidson, which vibrates and it's really rough and very raw experience, right? And yeah, so you have these personalities that are built by associating specific abilities or characteristics with the brand, right? And this is something that takes a long time to develop, right? Look at companies like Hyundai, for example. Hyundai is a company that entered the U.S. market. They sell cars. I'm assuming everybody knows this, right? But they entered the U.S. market in the 80s, and it was an absolute disaster. Their cars were not up to par, and because of that, they were basically the late night show comedians were making jokes about them, right? And so that's how bad it was. And they left the US market, and then they came back again in the 90s, right? 10 years later. And they have quite successfully now entered the market. However, if you ask people what Hyundai stands for as a brand, for the most part, I don't think they've been very successful at creating a strong brand positioning so far. So building these brand personalities is something that is very difficult even for companies that are somewhat successful, right? Even for companies that a lot of people know. So because of that, I want to emphasize how difficult it is to build the personalities and how it takes a long time and a lot of advertising and marketing dollars so that you can actually convey these stories to people. So we already mentioned what brand personality is, which is essentially a set of attributes that make the brand unique, stand out on its own, and have characteristics similar to a person, right? So it's this idea of anthropomorphism, right? That, we treat objects sometimes like they're people, right? Because they have traits that are similar to people, okay? And in particular, we treat brands like that, right? They have their own personality, their own way of being, right? And not only that, most brands that are successful, the way they do their marketing for the most part, it's like a story, right? And the story becomes powerful, especially if you start living the story, right? If you become part of the story, if you start interpreting the story instead of just taking for granted whatever the author is telling you that the story is about, right? And this way of looking at stories in general, and when it comes down to brands in particular, is what we call reader response theory, right? Where the reader gets so involved in the story that it starts basically pushing the stories. This idea of co-creation, right? Where something gets created together with, in this case, the reader and the writer, right? Or the company and the consumer, okay? Another thing that tends to be common in a lot of these very successful brands is this idea of the underdog, right? Where the story of the brand is told in a way that it highlights the difficult beginnings of the brand and how the brand started from sometimes nowhere, right? So companies like Apple, for example, right, where the company was put together in a garage, with two people that, at least in one of the two people's case, they just didn't even finish college, right? That's the case of Steve Jobs. Anyway, so brands that have strong personalities tend to do well in the marketplace, right? So this idea of developing a brand personality, whereas it's very expensive and time-consuming, is something that is done right. It usually creates a loyal following, right, which is important. Now, it could also bring the opposite, right? If the values that you are championing as a brand are not necessarily accepted by some of the consumers, you might actually get negative fans, people that are trying to bring down the brand. And one thing that you might find associated with that is this idea, and my German's bad, so my apologies, doppelganger, right? Which are basically lookalikes of the brand that are essentially criticizing the brand. Here you have an example for Starbucks, right? Where, the text is changed to say sugar bomb, right? This idea that maybe what you're getting when you're getting your latte is not much different from, I don't know, getting ice cream or something like that, right? Because at the end of the day, these are really high calorie items that maybe are not exactly healthy, right? Not helping society get rid of some of the problems that they actually have, like obesity, for example. Anyway, good. Maybe memes are also somewhat associated with this, or they can be if they are negative memes, right? And finally, the last thing that I want to close with when it comes down to brand personalities is that at the end of the day, people are smart. And if you want to build a brand personality, whatever you are trying to create, it needs to be consistent with your actions. So people are going to learn not only from what you say, but more importantly, from what you do, right? So if you're trying to build a certain personality and you're trying to associate some traits or some characteristics with your brand, the actions that you're going to have to undertake as a brand need to be consistent with that you're trying to convey. Okay, so if you're trying to become a luxury brand, right, you're going to have high prices and exclusive distribution, right? That will make sense, because if you try to be luxurious but you are cheap, people take that as a confusing signal, right? So the signals that you're sending to the marketplace in the form of the actions that you're undertaking needs to be always consistent with what it is that you're trying to convey. Here you have a table with some simple examples of that. And I think this is common sense, but like we say in Spain, common sense is probably the least common of all the senses, right? So that's part one.